Get in the game with the college-branded Venmo debit card. Wreck your team with every tap and earn up to 5% cash back with Venmo Stash, a new rewards program from Venmo. No monthly fee, no minimum balance, just school pride and spending power. Get in the game and sign up for the Venmo debit card at venmo.com/collegecard. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. Select schools available. Venmo Stash terms and exclusions apply at venmo.me/stash terms. Max $100 cash back per month.
For the News and Observer, I'm Danielle Battaglia, your host for this week's episode of Under the Dome. It is Monday, and I am here with Will Doran. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, Danielle. I hope you are too.
I am. It was a big week last week for North Carolina. Huge news. We got named by CNBC as the #1 state for business. And one of the reasons that we were named that is because they said state leaders managed to put aside their deep political divisions to bring business to North Carolina, which I want to talk to you about.
Yeah, I think a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction to that was to laugh, maybe even a little bit harder than I just did, because anyone who's paid attention to North Carolina politics at all in the last 15 years, knows that we are a pretty politically divided state. However, I think CNBC was right in that even though we are, so vitriolic in so many parts of our politics, one area where really Democrats and Republicans have gotten along is on economic development and business things. Obviously we have a Republican-led legislature, Democratic governor, but, Governor Cooper kind of, has made a name for himself as a more moderate, business-friendly Democrat. And really the North Carolina Democratic Party has always kind of been known as more business-friendly. I mean, even well before Republicans took over control here in 2011, we still didn't allow unions, and that's actually a big part of the reason why we did so well in those rankings is because we are, I think maybe the least unionized state or maybe the second least unionized state in the country. It's usually like us in South Carolina kind of flip-flop back and forth as to who's number 49 and who's number 50. But, that's, while it's, obviously labor advocates will say that's not great for workers. Business advocates will say it's great for businesses. They don't have to worry about, nearly as many regulations and, having to pay people more and things like that, which, is something that businesses like. But Cooper was up in DC recently to talk about this. Well, I don't think he was in DC to talk about this, but he was in DC when the news broke. And Danielle, I know that you talked to him. What did he have to say about these rankings?
Well, it was interesting. He's very excited. He thinks it's due to our diverse workforce that we have here in North Carolina. And it was interesting. I tried to talk to him about the union laws that we have, and he immediately told me that he wants to expand Medicaid, which has been a big issue here in North Carolina of late.
Not exactly an answer to the question about unions.
No. He said that's what we need next to get business here is to expand Medicaid, and that should be done in the next week or so. So he kind of sidestepped my question, and in fairness to him, he said that's not something that they're going to touch right now in the General Assembly, and so let's talk about something we can get done. Medicaid expansion. We had 3 minutes together, the governor and I. It was a very quick interview, and he had been at the White House to talk about the American Rescue Plan and how it affected the workforce, which is on brand to what was going on that day. So he had a lot on his plate, and it was a quick interview. But yeah, that's basically where it went from there.
Yeah, the Medicaid angle is interesting. I've been covering that here at the legislature this past year, and it really kind of came out of left field almost. Big name Republicans who have been very strongly opposed to Medicaid for years here in North Carolina, even as most other states in the country, red and blue alike, have expanded it. We have resisted it here in North Carolina. Saw a complete 180 this year from Senate Leader Phil Berger. He actually, he had kind of a almost self-deprecating quote, or at least self-aware quote at what their initial press release. He said, if anybody has been more opposed to Medicaid than me in North Carolina, I'd like to meet them because I don't think that person exists. But I also want to, tell that person why I've changed my mind on it. He mentioned his reasoning from there, and it's become a big push at the legislature with Republican backing that just was never really there. There were always, for at least the last 5 years or so, a handful of Republicans who supported it and who put forward, conservative approaches to Medicaid expansion, but those never really seemed to go anywhere. A big, actually, thing that killed it originally was that they really want there to be work requirements attached. And those started getting struck down as unconstitutional in other states, which then scared off support here in North Carolina. It kind of died out. But with the new, more conservative U.S. Supreme Court, there's a little bit more hope that actually states could be allowed to implement work requirements. So that's a piece of it. That's not the only piece, actually. And part of it, as you mentioned, Danielle, was from the federal stimulus package that the Democratic Congress and President Biden passed, which would just give essentially a signing bonus. It's a little bit more complicated, but it's basically just a cash payment to states that expand Medicaid. North Carolina would get $1.5 billion over 2 years, which is a nice little chunk of change.
I would love that kind of money.
And obviously you said, Governor Cooper was up there talking about that. Did he mention that angle specifically when he was up there in DC?
We didn't get a chance to talk about it. Specific to that, he did talk about the certificate of need, and that's been some pushback that he's been getting, or actually, I guess lawmakers have been getting. And so he was talking about how the hospitals basically have control of getting that passed right now. And they need to work with lawmakers to figure out their differences and get the Medicaid expansion passed.
Yeah, well, and that is just a whole can of worms. Certificate of need is one of those things that is really, really complicated and really technical, but is massively important. I mean, it's worth billions of dollars to the healthcare industry. And essentially what it is, it's these sets of laws that we have in North Carolina. A few other states have them. I think by this point, most states have gone away from these rules, but we're not the only state with them. But essentially what it says is it's just a strong government regulation on the healthcare industry. And if someone wants to open up a new hospital, they have to get the state's permission. They have to show that there's need and get a certificate, hence certificate of need, to open up that hospital. But it even expands beyond that. Like if you want to buy a new MRI machine for your medical practice, you have to get a certificate of need. If you want to open up an ambulatory surgical center where you can kind of, go around and, do surgeries at multiple locations, you need to get a certificate of need. And so critics say that it's just basically gives a monopoly to big hospitals who are able to afford the lawyers that can then, turn these certificate of need fights into really lengthy, drawn out, super expensive court battles. And, anyone who follows legal news in North Carolina sees the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court are constantly ruling on certificate of need cases. And these things drag on for years and cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, in legal fees. So critics say that this is just, helping the big hospitals, maintain a monopoly essentially and crush competition. Supporters, who tend to be those big hospitals, say, no, it actually helps us keep costs down because we don't have to be constantly buying new equipment, constantly, doing big fancy renovations that we don't necessarily need because the hospital down the road is also doing big fancy renovations. Or is also buying a new MRI machine or whatever. So they're saying this actually keeps costs down for patients because we're not consistently competing with each other and buying new stuff and raising costs on ourselves, which, then obviously gets passed down to the patient. So there's two different schools of thought. Some kind of free market conservatives, particularly in the Senate, are very much want to get rid of it. But as you said, the hospitals want to keep it. The House has been in favor of keeping it, and it seems that the governor is kind of leaning that way as well. So I don't know how that'll go in negotiations. There's three parties negotiating. You got the House, the Senate, and the governor. And if two of the three want to keep our current certificate of need laws, then maybe that means that they're going to stay. But the Senate's got some strong negotiators, so we'll see. There's a lot of moving parts to the Medicaid expansion because it's very possible that it won't just be Medicaid. It could be plenty of different healthcare reforms, from that certificate of need stuff to this thing called the SAVE Act, which people have probably heard about, which basically would free up certain, they're called advanced practice registered nurses. Basically, a nurse with a master's degree or a PhD, some advanced training, would be able to do more without having a doctor's supervision. That's also been controversial. That's been talked about. Should that be attached to Medicaid expansion or not? So we'll see. Cooper told you, and this kind of surprised me, that he was expecting to have some sort of deal pretty soon, maybe even this week.
It surprised me too. I wasn't expecting to write about Medicaid this week. He said it, and I actually asked him, I think twice, like, did you say this week? Do you think that's a possibility? And he was really hoping for it. I've sensed from talking our conversations with other Republicans, or he's not a Republican, but talking with Republicans in the House and Senate, that there's some question about whether that's possible, but that is what he told me, is he is really hoping. He thinks it's very possible that we are there to a in the next week or so kind of deal. So we'll see. I know the legislature has a date coming up, I think on the 26th, to come back. I haven't heard that they are coming back, but there is a date open. So we could see.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are going to take a quick break right here. But Danielle and I are going to be back right after that. We're going to talk a little bit more on the economic side of why we're the number one state for business, not just this Medicaid expansion side, even though the Medicaid expansion is really the forward-looking news. But we're going to talk about, a little bit more of the economic side when we come back from the break. So stay tuned for that.
Not sure how to tackle your taxes? Are you sweating the small print? You may be experiencing FOMO, the fear of messing up. The answer? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They help you get your biggest refund, and then we help you do more with it, with a personalized plan designed to help you hit your money goals. It's time to take your taxes to the max. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
We are back, and we want to go into the economic side of this news that came out this week of the announcement from CNBC that we are number one in the country for business. And so talk to me a little bit about that, Will, and what you know.
Well, it was a big focus of the state budget recently that just passed. Actually, it was kind of good timing. They passed the budget and really focused a lot, said we are putting a ton of money in this budget into economic development. And then a week later, the CNBC story comes out. So I don't think that CNBC rated us the number one story because they, read the state budget and said, ooh, this looks good. It was much more complicated than that. But it was good timing there.
They read your reporting.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, CNBC, for being loyal News and Observer readers. God, yeah, we've written a lot of budget stories. In the budget, it did not have as big of raises for teachers and state employees as Democrats and Governor Cooper wanted. It did not have as aggressive, or any actually, tax cuts, which some business interests and conservatives wanted. But what it did have was, one, a lot of money, several $1 billion, socked away into savings, which supporters said, this is going to help us in case, there is a recession down the line. We're not going to be in the same position where we were in 2009, where, the state had to really make some cuts. We're going to be better prepared. And two, there's something like $1.6 billion, I think. And that might even be a low estimate on how much additional money we're putting towards economic development. Obviously, we had already been planning on spending a lot of money on economic development this year anyways, but we had $6 billion more than expected in revenue because we are a good state for business. And out of that 6 point whatever billion it was, they took 1.6 billion at least, to put towards further economic development plans. And that's everything from, sprucing up little regional airports around the state. Since a lot of the fancy CEOs like to fly into the small airports instead of flying to RDU or Charlotte, obviously it helps businesses that aren't located right in the triangle get products flown around better if they've got better local airports. And then there's money for JDIG, which is our big tax incentives program that essentially pays companies to come here. Helps them expand utilities, things like that. So here is some talk about that from the House floor during the budget debate. Some Republican budget writers explaining why that is important.
Key components of this budget are the investments in economic development. We have $876 million to support major economic development projects. We have $450 million for new economic development transformative projects. $225 million for reimbursement to a recipient of an existing JDIG transformative project. That means existing businesses are growing. $112.5 million for economic development high yield project. We had $5 million for the GREAT grant program to expand rural broadband access. $38 million for airports. $600,000 for dam repairs. $7.8 million for hospitals. $5.6 million for parks and recreation projects.
And there you go. And as I mentioned, this budget didn't make any further moves on tax cuts, but last year's budget made a pretty major move, and it's going to take the corporate income tax down to 0 over the course of the next few years. Personal income tax rates are also dropping a little bit as well. We already had a fairly low income tax rate, one of the lowest in the country for both people and businesses. Now it's going to be slightly lower for people and nothing for businesses within a few years, unless, of course, something happens to make that change in the meantime, the next 6 or 7 years before that's slated to completely go away. But as you mentioned, actually, at the start of this podcast, Danielle, Democrats like Governor Cooper and, also CNBC, I think, validated this as well. Another reason why we rated so good for businesses because we have this diverse and educated workforce. And Democrats have been a little concerned about cutting this income, the corporate income taxes, especially, saying, okay, well, what happens to public education? What happens to, colleges and college funding here when that goes away? Obviously, it's impossible to tell yet because we're still having that tax money. It hasn't gone away yet. Republicans say, look at us. We got $6.5 billion even after we cut taxes. And so, I think that will continue to be a political fight, even if the national media says that we've put aside some of our political divisions. I think you will certainly continue to see, political fights over that. How much should we emphasize cutting taxes versus keeping taxes so we can continue funding education? Where is that sweet spot? But it seems that at least for now, we're getting a lot of credit for it. So
it's always good for our state.
All right. Well, any parting thoughts from up in DC there?
I'd say to keep reading the News and Observer to find out what businesses are coming to our state. And from there, we should move on to headliner of the week. So what you got for us?
Ooh, I've got to say my headliner of the week is Wake County. Politico recently wrote a story that said, I think the headline was like, these 20 counties are going to decide who controls Congress. And, on one hand, maybe not great, just for, concepts of democracy that 20 counties around the entire country are, what Congress comes down to. And if you don't live in one of those counties, maybe your vote doesn't matter quite as much. But I guess good news for local readers and listeners is one of those 20 counties was Wake County. It's the biggest county here in North Carolina, and specifically the reason why they put it on the list was because there's such a huge number of unaffiliated voters in Wake County. Now, anyone who really knows about politics knows that even if someone calls themselves an unaffiliated voter, that doesn't really necessarily mean that they're a swing voter. Some of them are. I'm an unaffiliated voter.
Me too.
Yes, I think you'll find that most reporters are. And a ton of people are. It's the fastest growing political affiliation in the state. And North Carolina in particular has a ton. But, North Carolina, or Wake County, I should say, even though we consistently vote blue, there's a ton more Republican voters in Wake County than there are in most of the, deep red counties around the state. So, Wake County still matters in Senate races. And down south, there's actually a new congressional district that's one of the few toss-up, truly competitive districts in the state that includes some of the southwest Wake suburbs, again, where I live, and then also Johnston County. That race between Bo Hines and Wiley Nickel is going to be probably pretty close in November. And, Republicans do have, it seems, a pretty decent shot of taking back the House of Representatives in Congress this year. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, Danielle, from your perch up there in DC.
No, you're correct.
But, if Wiley Nickel can pull that one off for the Democrats, then, there's just, that's one more, seat, keeping it a little bit closer. And then obviously the Senate race between Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd is going to be huge. So Wake County voters, pat yourself on the back. You're some of the few people in the country who get to decide what happens with Congress.
Which I'm excited about. I like that it's in our home state. I'm going to go more wonky and less political, and I'm going to go with selfie safety, because I don't know if you guys saw the story this week. I believe it's out of my family's home country of Sicily. It's where my grandparents are from, and there was an American tourist there who tried to take a selfie in a volcano, and he fell into one of the craters there. He is okay, or at least, reasonably okay. He's still alive and doing all right. But I thought we were past this danger with selfies phase that we went through for a while. So I'm just reminding the public to be careful when you're taking a selfie and be aware of where you step and what animals are nearby. So that is my headliner of the week.
All right. Well, thank you for your volcano-based PSA, Danielle.
You're welcome. Well, with that, I'm Danielle Battaglia here with Will Doran. Thank you guys for listening.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter, also called Under the Dome, at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.